All right, so picture this. It's 1914, you're in Europe, and everywhere you look, there's this like tension. Like the whole world's about to snap.
Yeah, it's like that moment right before a thunderstorm breaks. You can just feel it in the air, right?
Exactly. And that's what we're going to try to unpack today. Why World War One? How did it go from like 0 to 100 to this massive global conflict that seemingly nobody could stop?
Well, and that's the thing, right? Looking back, it's easy to sort of fall into that trap of thinking, oh, it was inevitable. But when you really dig into this period, you realize it was this perfect storm of long-term issues, these underlying causes that had been building for decades.
Right, and our sources really dig into that powder keg analogy, right? Like what were the elements that made this conflict almost unavoidable? And they really seem to focus on this idea of nationalism that was spreading through Europe.
And it's important to distinguish this from like just simple patriotism. This was nationalism on steroids. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
this absolute unshakable belief that your nation, your people were superior,
Yeah.
that you were destined for greatness, for power.
So basically every nation thinking they're the main character.
Exactly. And you can imagine how that gets dangerous quickly, especially when you have a newly unified Germany, right? They're flexing their industrial muscles, they're feeling their oats.
Oh yeah, talk about an ego boost. Suddenly you're the new kid on the block and you've got all the cool toys, the factories, the tech.
And you better believe everyone else is watching, and they're not just going to sit back, right? So they think, well, we need a bigger military. We need to go grab some colonies to prove we're strong too. And that's where you get into this arms race, this idea of militarism.
It's like a vicious cycle, right? One country ups the ante and then everyone else feels like they have to keep pace.
Totally. And we're not just talking about like having a small defensive army.
Yeah.
This is full-blown industrial scale militarization.
Yeah.
Factories pumping out more and more powerful weapons. I mean, you start seeing machine guns, massive artillery pieces that can hurl a shell for miles, even the early stages of tanks and airplanes being used in warfare.
Crazy. It's like something out of a science fiction novel, but it's actually happening. And our sources talk about this arms race, specifically between Britain and Germany. Like they were obsessed with these warships, these dreadnoughts, right?
Oh, absolutely. It was the naval equivalent of my dad's tougher than your dad, you know?
Yeah.
Each one trying to build a bigger, badder boat than the other guy. Just this constant one-upmanship.
And then on top of all that, it wasn't just about like defending what they already had. There's also this whole other element, this whole imperialism thing.
Right. This wasn't some theoretical game of Risk. They were out there actually grabbing territory.
I mean, wasn't basically all of Africa carved up by European powers at this point?
It's a sad but true part of the story.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just about resources, though that was definitely a factor. It was this idea of prestige, of global dominance. You know, you'd hear phrases like, the sun never sets on the British Empire. It was supposed to make you sound impressive.
But really, it just meant you were good at conquering other people's land.
Pretty much. And of course, when everyone's out there trying to grab a piece of the pie, it creates this environment of, well, competition, rivalry, and eventually conflict. It's almost unavoidable.
Right, so you've got all that simmering, and then, to make matters even more volatile, you have this whole web of alliances developing.
Oh yeah, those alliances. Those are fun.
It's like a recipe for disaster, really. Like, country A promises to defend country B, but then country B has a secret pact with country C, who's sworn enemies with country A's cousin, country D. You get what I'm saying? Yeah. Just this tangled web of obligation.
You're not kidding. It got ridiculously complicated. And that was supposed to be the deterrent, right? The logic was, if you attack my buddy, you're going to have to fight me too. So don't even think about it.
Yeah, good luck keeping track of who's fighting who and why.
Exactly. But the problem is, in reality, it created this incredibly dangerous situation where a conflict in one corner of Europe, even a relatively small one, could drag the whole continent into war.
And that's exactly what happened, right? Because when we talk about how World War I actually started, it wasn't some big declaration, some massive invasion. It was an assassination.
Yeah, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary, shot by a Serbian nationalist, Gavrilo Princip, in Sarajevo.
It just seems wild that this one event could send the whole world spiraling, you know?
It does, but that's the thing about a powder keg, right?
Well,
You
yeah.
just need that one spark. And in this case, that assassination was it. Austria-Hungary, they declare war on Serbia, and then boom, dominoes start falling.
Because everyone's got their alliances, their treaties. Suddenly it's not just those two countries. Everyone's obligated to jump in to defend their friends.
And within weeks, you've got a full-blown continental war on your hands, all because of that one event in Sarajevo.
It's just wild to think about, right? This one event in Sarajevo, and suddenly you have this massive war engulfing all of Europe.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to just how volatile the situation was, you know.
Hmm.
All those underlying tensions we talked about, the nationalism, the militarism, the alliances, it created this like tinderbox effect.
Ready to explode at any moment. And once it did, it became clear that this wasn't going to be like the wars of the past.
Not at all. You have to remember, this is a time when people still had this like romanticized view of warfare. All these stories about glory and heroism, knights in shining armor charging into battle.
Right, like it was all some grand adventure.
Exactly. The idea was, you'd march off to defend your nation's honor and you'd be home by Christmas. Victorious, of course.
Yeah.
But World War I, it shattered those illusions pretty quickly.
Yeah, our sources really drove home the brutal reality of what it was actually like, especially that whole trench warfare thing. That sounds just absolutely horrific.
It was a nightmare. Imagine for years on end, you're stuck in these muddy, rat-infested ditches, facing constant artillery bombardment, sniper fire. I mean, can you imagine the psychological toll that takes on a person?
It's hard to even wrap your head around. And our sources mentioned something called like going over the top, which just sounds absolutely terrifying. What was that all about?
So basically, going over the top meant you were ordered to leave the relative safety, and I use that term loosely, of the trenches and charge across no man's land.
No man's land.
Yeah, it was the strip of land between the opposing trenches. So you're basically charging straight into a storm of machine gun fire, artillery shells, barbed wire. It's basically a suicide mission. The casualty rates were just astronomical.
It's heartbreaking, really. And I guess that's what we see in battles like Verdun and the Somme, right? Our sources highlighted those as prime examples of this new kind of warfare, this war of attrition.
Exactly. Battles that dragged on for months with hundreds of thousands of casualties and often for just a few yards of gained or lost territory. It's just mind-boggling to think about.
Our sources brought up the Newfoundland Regiment. They fought bravely at Beaumont Hamel, but were practically wiped out in a single day.
It's a tragedy. And Beaumont Hamel, it's just one example among many. The human cost of this war, it's almost impossible to comprehend. Entire generations decimated.
And not just the physical casualties, right? It's the psychological scars, the trauma that these soldiers carried with them long after the guns fell silent.
Absolutely. Shell shock, what we now call PTSD, it was rampant. And it wasn't just the soldiers in the trenches, right? The scale of this war, the total war aspect, it meant that civilians were impacted on a level never seen before.
It's like this dark cloud hanging over everything. But it's interesting, because amidst all this horror, amidst the mud and the bloodshed, something else was happening too, something kind of unexpected.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, it's like this shared experience of unimaginable hardship. It actually ended up forging a stronger sense of national identity, particularly for countries like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. It's kind of a strange thing to think about, right? Out of all this suffering, the shared trauma, a stronger sense of who they were as nations kind of emerged.
Yeah, it is strange. It's like you'd think it would have the opposite effect,
Yeah.
But it's like going through something that intense. It either breaks you apart or it brings you together. And in the case of these countries, it seems like it really did solidify their sense of national identity.
And it makes you think about the bonds that form, right? Like you're in the trenches with these people, depending on each other for survival. It's got to create a connection you wouldn't find anywhere else.
Oh, absolutely. They went through hell and back together. And you see this reflected in the sources we looked at, especially with the Battle of Vimy Ridge. That seemed to be a turning point for Canada, right?
Yeah, our sources definitely pointed to Vimy Ridge as a pivotal moment.
It was a hard-fought victory against the Germans. And not just a symbolic victory, a strategically important one. And for Canadians, it was this moment where they really proved themselves on the world stage.
Right, like they could hold their own. They weren't just some colony. They were a force to be reckoned with.
Exactly. And it wasn't just Canada. I mean, you look at Australia and New Zealand. For them, it seems like the defining moment, at least in those early years, was actually a defeat. Gallipoli.
Yeah, and you don't usually see defeat celebrated as this, like, seminal moment in a nation's history. So what was it about Gallipoli that made it so important for Australia and New Zealand?
Well, for starters, it was their first major military action as independent nations. So even though they were fighting as part of the British Empire, they had their own units, their own commanders. It was their fight.
And reading about it, you really get a sense of, like, the sheer courage of those soldiers. They faced overwhelming odds, impossible conditions, but they kept fighting.
Yeah, it was a brutal campaign. But even in defeat, that courage, that willingness to sacrifice everything for their country, it really captured the spirit of those nations. It became a part of their identity.
It's kind of tragic in a way, right? That took a war, this horrific event, to really bring that sense of nationhood to the forefront.
Yeah, it's bittersweet. But that's often how these things work, right?
Yeah.
Out of great tragedy can come these moments of unity, of self-discovery. And of course, we can't talk about World War I without talking about the aftermath, the Treaty of Versailles,
Yeah.
which, well, let's just say it didn't exactly achieve what it set out to do.
Yeah, peace for our time, right? Didn't quite work out that way. Instead of preventing future wars, it seems like the treaty might have actually made another one more likely.
You hit the nail on the head. And it's really one of the great tragedies of the 20th century. You have all this death, all this destruction, and then instead of focusing on reconciliation, on rebuilding the victors, they go for retribution, especially towards Germany.
Yeah, our sources definitely highlighted that. The treaty blamed Germany for the war and then hit them with these incredibly harsh penalties.
Huge reparations, loss of territory, their military was basically dismantled. It was meant to cripple them, to prevent them from ever becoming a threat again.
Which, spoiler alert, kind of backfired. Because that resentment, that economic instability, it created this breeding ground for extremism, for ideologies like Nazism.
And that's the danger, right? When you let anger and the desire for revenge dictate the terms of peace, you end up sowing the seeds for the next conflict.
And it wasn't just the Treaty of Versailles, right? Our sources also talked about Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, his vision for a League of Nations.
Ah, yes, Wilson's idealism, a world governed by diplomacy and cooperation. It was a noble idea, but ultimately doomed to fail.
It's sad, really. Like, imagine if it had worked. Imagine a world where countries actually came together to solve their problems peacefully, instead of just resorting to violence.
It's a nice thought, but the reality is the world just wasn't ready for that kind of radical change. There was too much self-interest, too much mistrust between nations.
And we can't forget about the Middle East either. Our sources make it clear that World War I was a major turning point in that region's history with repercussions that we're still dealing with today.
Absolutely. You had the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the rise of these new nation states, and then you have the issue of oil.
Oil always seems to find its way into the mix, doesn't it?
It's the curse of the modern world. And the discovery of vast oil reserves in the Middle East, well, it just made that region even more strategically important. And that attracted attention, interference from outside powers, especially those who wanted to control that oil.
Which, again, just leads to more conflict, more instability.
Exactly. And it's a pattern we've seen repeat itself over and over again, not just in the Middle East, but all over the world.
So looking back at World War I from the vantage point of, well, over a century later, what are some of the key takeaways here? It's about more than just battles and treaties, right?
Oh, way more.
Yeah.
If anything, it's a cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly things can spiral out of control, how unchecked nationalism and militarism can have devastating consequences. And it's a reminder of how important it is to understand history, to learn from the mistakes of the past so we don't repeat them.
Because the echoes of World War I, they're still with us today. In the conflicts we see around the world, in the political divisions that seem to be widening, it's a sobering thought.
It is. But it's also a reminder that we have a choice. We can choose to learn from the past to build a better future, or we can choose to ignore the lessons of history and risk repeating the same mistakes. It's up to us.
It's a lot to think about, and we've barely scratched the surface. But that's the thing about history, isn't it? It's full of these complex, messy, fascinating stories. And the more we learn about them, the more we understand about ourselves and the world we live in. We hope you'll join us next time for another deep dive into the past.